Many claim they like riding, but I know that they ain't. Ride or die. I go hard in the paint, yeah, homie, I'm a saint. Ride or die. Many claim they like riding, but I know that they ain't. They see the red and they call me a devil, but mind the treble, let me level with you. I used to idolize rappers that paint they face, but now I rock the blood of Christ ever since I've been saved by grace.
I was just saying that my intros work so well for going into a philosophical conversation. All right. Once again, to those watching now, thank you for watching. To those who will probably more than likely watch tomorrow morning, I appreciate it. My guests tonight are Dr. Ryan Mullins, Dr. Graham Oppy. We will be talking about the nature of God. And then I'll let you two gentlemen get started from there, and then I'll fade to the background, and I'll come back about 5 minutes when we're getting ready to wrap it up.
Cool. So Graham, we wanted to start with the concept of God. I think you and I might agree a lot on this, but I'll let you go ahead and go first. What you think the concept of God is?
Okay, so maybe I'll start with some background things to talk about, and then so one thing that I think you have to think about here is language. What's your view about the kind of language that we use when we talk about God, in particular, when we talk about God's nature? So, I mean, there are people out there who think you can't do this at all. You can only say what God isn't, not what God is. And then there are people who say you can sort of do it, but you have to use analogical language, right? Every term that we use has to be stretched in certain kinds of ways. And then there are people who think, no, the same terms that we use to apply to us apply to God as well. Of course, for example, God's goodness exceeds ours unimaginably, but it's still the same concept of goodness that we're using in the two cases. And so one of the questions about the concept here is going to be about how you handle that question about language. The second thing is exactly what we're trying to define, how general we're going. So theism could be quite broad. We could be including polytheism, pantheism in the thing that we're trying to define, or we could be going quite narrow and trying to define or to say what the concept is of a very particular God, right? So you kind of have to set some ground rules to get going. I assume that what you want to, or what we want to think about is going to be something like the kind of God that Christians believe in. Maybe that's too narrow, but maybe that's where we want to go. So then I'll just kind of throw it back to you, having said that much. So
Yeah, so I want to go. I want to allow like something kind of broad, but not too terribly broad. So what I would say, like one of the core concepts of God would be it would involve two things. So the claim that whatever God is absolutely perfect. And then whatever else God is going to be the foundation of reality. So the thing that explains all of this other stuff. But then what does it mean to be like what explains like why God's perfect? What explains how God is the foundation of reality? That's where I think things get interesting. And that's where like we get into like conceptions or models of God. But I want to say like that's usually what I think is kind of like the core claim. A lot of people in a lot of different religious traditions can usually agree on something in that neighborhood of this sort of concept. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so at a certain level, that sounds like it's going to be right. I mean, you could go a bit broader. So elsewhere, I've tried out saying something like this, that the gods are kind of the people who have the most power, very roughly. And that doesn't work perfectly, but it works kind of reasonably well. But that gives you a much bigger thing that you can fill out, because now polytheism can be on the table, whereas the way that you want to go, it isn't. But that's fine, right? For the purposes of our discussion, we can think of God as perfect, and that leaves open even the questions about whether we can know anything about God's intrinsic nature.
Right, because I guess you could still go, yeah, he's perfect. I just don't know what on earth that means. And I can't say anything positive about it. I mean, yeah, I guess it does leave that open. I don't want to do any of that, but it does leave that open. Yeah. Yeah. So then when it comes to the models of God or the conceptions of God, what I would say is each of these is trying to give some sort of unique articulation of what explains why God is perfect and kind of explaining how God is the foundation of reality. So as I see it, something like classical theism and then like your neoclassical or your modified classical views and then open theistic views, they're going to say that God's the foundation of reality because God creates the universe out of nothing. So some kind of doctrine of creation ex nihilo. Whereas panentheists, they usually want to go, well, that's false. We don't like that. Either the universe just necessarily emanates from God or God eternally creates it such that God's always existing with a universe or a multiverse or a bunch of cosmic stuff. So they have some kind of way they're going to try to articulate that foundation. They claim that God's like the foundation of reality, and then the divine perfections. Well, they're going to disagree over different attributes, but so that's where I think things get interesting, though, is in terms of these models. Well, they'll go, well, I think God has to be timeless. That's what makes him perfect. And someone else will go, that's stupid. I don't like that. God's got to be temporal. That's the real perfection. So those are going to be, I think, within the conceptions or the models of God. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Right. So there might be people out there at the moment who might be a bit unsure about whether they want to go with creation as thinking about that in causal terms. So I'm thinking about someone like Kenny Pierce, for whom God's the ground of, in the kind of philosopher's technical sense of ground, right? And that might be excluded on the kind of on what you just said, but probably should be kind of in the plan.
It should be. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, because so grounding is a non-causal claim, but that would still be a way of saying, well, this is how God's the foundation of reality. Because he's the ungrounded and everything else is grounded. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Mm-hmm.
But again, this is just part of the, okay, so we're moving on from the concept to the sort of different conception, different ways of spelling it out.
Yeah. So in some of your own work, though, you've tried to talk a bit about this concept conception distinction. I didn't know if you wanted to elaborate a bit more on that.
So this is testing my memory because it's
that's okay. Yeah, because I was obsessively reading your stuff this week to remind myself.
I wrote this stuff. So what I was thinking was that there might be some level at which it could be broader than we're going, at which there's a kind of concept of something ultimate, or maybe it's the kind of thing I was talking about before in terms of kind of power relations, or something that's shared by people from a whole lot of different religious and philosophical traditions or perspectives. They all agree on that much. But then in their own practice, they don't just operate with that very general concept. They have a particular conception of what God's like. You can think of it as sort of like a theory of what God is, what God's like. And that's what they actually operate with. And the people disagree, and they can argue about which is the right conception of God while still agreeing on the kind of general concept. So that was just the idea. It's nothing very subtle or complicated.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right. Especially, so when I look at a lot of contemporary debates within Christian theology, sometimes people who want to say God's like timeless and impassible and immutable and simple, they'll look at other people who will just deny all of that, and they'll say, well, you're denying that God's perfect, or you're denying that God's really God. And sometimes they'll say these really very ugly phrases of, you're denying the godness of God. And I want to go, well, no, they all have the same concept of God. They all agree that they're trying to do perfect being theology. They still want to agree that God's the foundation of reality. So they have the same concept. They're just dealing with some different conceptions. So the debate needs to be somewhere else, not in terms of, are you denying the godness of God or something like that?
Yeah, so I'm sympathetic to that point of view.
Okay. That's what I thought. One thing before we move on, I was curious about this, because I want to say that the foundation of reality aspect is really important to the concept of God. It can't just simply be whoever has the most power. And here would be one reason for thinking this. So when I look at like Jainism, for example, so Jainism says, well, there's no God. We don't want to have a God. There's just a bunch of souls and a bunch of cosmic stuff floating around, and that's how it's always been forever and ever. Amen. except no amen, because there's no
Yeah.
God. So we don't want to say these things. Now, the goal on Jainism is to reach a state of omniscience. That's how you get liberated. And so they've got a bunch of omniscient beings. And some of these omniscient beings, they're pretty awesome. You might want to actually talk to them, not pray to them, because that's too religious. But we want to talk to them to get help to get our own liberation. And so I've got these omniscient beings that seem to have a lot more power than the rest of us. But they're swearing that's not a god because it didn't create anything. It's not responsible for the existence of anything.
Yeah.
So do you think something like that would kind of motivate you to go, yeah, we should put that idea of divine foundationalism into the concept of
So
God?
so the actual words that I used was have an exercise power over. And it's not clear from what you just said
Mhm.
that those omniscient beings fit that description exactly. But then perhaps that's just to agree with you, right? That there's this that part of it, but it might be that it's not a creative role,
Mhm.
right? It's not that not creation. It might just be that it's a kind of role that you step into. But it didn't sound as though on the picture that you just gave of the Jains that they're kind of interventionist, that they kind of intervene in human affairs in various kinds of ways or interact with us.
Usually not too much. There's some debates about different Jainist, like Jaina texts, where they want to say there's an omniscient being who was responsible for bringing this text into existence. So that way our text can be just as reliable as these other religions floating around. But they're still swearing like there's no God here. So they allow that kind of intervention. But that's where things where I don't know enough to be able to start judging on this point.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've the account that I gave when I gave it was already kind of dodgy, because if you think about say Greek polytheism, the
Mhm.
fates in a certain sense have power over the gods.
Mhm.
So the story, I never really thought that the story worked, but it was a kind of very general story that seemed to fit a lot of cases.
Okay, so because I was very sympathetic to this, so so I guess so you're worried. So one worry I guess you would have is if I have this kind of idea of here's the concept of God and here's these different conceptions, I'm not capturing all of the possible things that could fall under the category of religion. Whereas I guess I don't feel the need to do that. I guess I'm more like here are some different models that seem like real live options today. Whereas if somebody's worried about some like ancestor gods or something, I'm like, I don't know. I guess that's not really a concern of mine, but that may be because I'm more interested in trying to figure out what options are available for like Christians or something like that.
Yeah. So, but that does really seem fine to me. I mean, there's maybe some way of talking about this, like Schellenberg's sort of ultimism, the sort
Mhm.
of what's of ultimate concern, and maybe that's going to capture absolutely kind of everything. But that might be too broad, because there might be things in there that you don't want to think of at all as being
Yeah.
God or gods. But it seems perfectly clear that we're going to have some use for a distinction between the concept of God and conceptions of God, because we do want to be able to talk about different models
Mhm.
of God, and we do want to be able to recognize that um, say Catholics and Protestants tend to have different models
Mhm.
of God, for example.
Yeah. So you feel okay to move on to infinity? Does that
Yeah,
sound good?
sure.
Cool. Okay, we gotta because we only have a finite amount of time, but we can do some infinity stuff. So one of the questions that I've been thinking about for a long time is it actually useful to talk about infinity when we're talking about the doctrine of God? So one of my former professors, Keith Yandell, I remember in class one day he said there are like three of the worst ideas to ever be introduced into the history of philosophical theology. Number one was ineffable mystery. Number two was simplicity, and then number three was infinity. And he's like, these are just awful. We just got to get rid of them entirely, which I found shocking at the time. But now I'm starting to kind of come around to the idea that maybe this isn't really that useful. So I've got some arguments I can run, but I was curious to get your take first, though, like what you think is infinity actually a useful way of thinking about the conception, like the concept or conceptions of God.
So one question here is going to be about what you mean by
Right.
infinity. In particular, if you're thinking about infinity in kind of mathematical terms, in the light of, say, the developments of set theory in the 19th century, or something like that, there's still an argument to be had about whether, I mean, for example, Cantor thought that his work had theological implications, right? So there's a question about its utility and its applicability. But you might also think that earlier, when people talked about infinity, this was I don't know, what's the technical term? They weren't even sort of approximating, employing a mathematical conception of infinity. They were just talking about absence of limitation or something like that. And so you might think that in a certain sense, when people are talking about the infinity, divine infinity, it just kind of follows from divine perfection, right? Immediately, right? There's no limitation to God's knowledge, for example. And so God has infinite knowledge, and that just means God has perfect knowledge. And if it turns out that there's only finitely many propositions and God knows all of them, so God's knowledge is infinite in the theological sense, but not in the mathematical sense.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends, right, whether
Mm-hmm.
you think that that was all that was going on when people started talking about divine infinity.
Right. So one of the things I really appreciated about your work was you tried to trace down some of the history of this. And I know the history is much more complicated than everything you mentioned in some of your writings on this, but it's just you were trying to trace out, and you point out like infinity is not something that people were comfortable predicating of God at various points throughout history. So I didn't know if you wanted to maybe say a little something about that.
Um,
If you don't remember, I can say things instead.
yeah, okay, you can. I'll
Sure.
let you do this
Okay.
bit.
So Plato and Aristotle. So some of the conceptions about infinity at that point are things like indeterminate, chaotic, unknowable,
Yeah,
and so when you look at some people who are like the early church fathers, for instance, not all of them are super happy about talking about God being indeterminate because God has a
or
nature, and anything that
chaotic.
has a or chaotic. Yeah, we don't want that because God's supposed to be like really good and wise. So do you really want to say God's chaotic? He's wise, that sounds bad. And then one of my favorite arguments is from Origen of Alexandria, where he says, "Well, if you're infinite, you're unknowable. Well, God knows Himself, so God can't be infinite." And I'm like, "Ooh, okay, that's interesting." So it's not really until you get to the Scholastic era where you see infinity, people being much more comfortable talking about infinity in some kind of more clear way instead of saying vague things like the fullness of being, which I don't really know what that means. And then when you look at Protestant and Catholic scholastics, infinity just becomes a very standard claim in textbooks. But here's where there's a bit of a plot twist. So the plot twist is this: when they talk about infinity, it's not clear what they mean, even still then. So sometimes they'll talk about infinity being like a distinct attribute. And then other times they'll talk about it as like the mode of each individual attribute.
Yeah.
So when we talk about power, God's got infinite power. God's got infinite knowledge or something like this. And then the other times they'll talk about it, it just usually means something like, well, it's just a metaphorical way of saying God's perfect. And you're like, well, that's not terribly interesting. And then the other way is like the kind of claim you made about unlimited. And that's where things get kind of weird because then you get a lot the pantheistic controversy that really starts up and running in the Western world, where, well, if God's really unlimited, well, if other things exist, well, I would put a limit on God. So there can't be these other substances that exist, like, because then God's really unlimited. So you're God, I'm a part of God. This table is part of God. This incredibly lime green couch that the university gave me is apparently as part of God as well, which makes me question the goodness of God. But these things are all supposed to be part of God, and so the definitions get fuzzy and they go in directions that not everybody is happy with. So I think that's where, like, at least some of the historical context here for people listening is to go, it's not straightforward. This has not always been an attribute people have been willing to predicate of God.
Right.
Yeah.
But all of that is still before we start to sort out the mathematical concept of
Yes.
infinity, because you get um, Galileo, maybe? No, is that who I mean? Yeah, Galileo, I think, arguing that there can't, the notion of mathematical infinity is just incoherent. Right. And that's an argument that kind of persisted, or a worry that persisted until the 19th century. I mean, I guess there are still people, a kind of tiny remnant of people who think that the kind of Cantorian solution isn't right. But most people these days think that you can kind of make sense of infinity mathematically. Right. But that's just a different idea. And but in discussions that I've read, lots of 20th century stuff, when people are talking about divine infinity, they seem to have this mathematical notion in mind, or at any rate, there are discussions in philosophy of religion where it's very clear that what we're talking about is infinity in the mathematical sense, whether time regresses infinitely or not, things like that.
Mhm. Right. So here's an example of this that I often see, especially in evangelical circles in the U.S. So they'll say all sin against an infinite God is infinitely heinous and therefore worthy of infinite punishment. And I'm like, are they using infinity in the exact same way in that argument? And I don't think they are, but they're trying to draw a very close connection between mathematical concepts and theological concepts there. So whatever the mathematical concept is supposed to be, it seems like it's playing a pretty big role in at least contemporary articulations of theology. And so that's where I want to start pushing back and going, is this actually useful? Is it really doing what you're thinking it's doing? So you mentioned Cantor's like concepts of infinity. Do you feel comfortable kind of explaining some of those for the audience?
I can have a shot. So,
Okay.
so a kind of standard idea of mathematical infinity is just to think about the natural numbers. So start counting from 1, 2, 3. How many of them are there? Well, pick any finite number n and add 1 to it, and you've got a bigger number. So it's kind of intuitive that here we have an infinity in mathematics. What Cantor showed is that there are bigger infinities than that one, or at least that was the start of it. And so one infinity that's going to be bigger than this, though I'm not going to try and make the argument, is if you think about all the subsets of the natural numbers. So a subset is just some collection of them, like 1, 2, 3 is a subset of the natural numbers, and 1, 2, 3 up to n is, but so is 5, 11, and 22. That's another subset. It turns out that there's just got to be more subsets than there are natural numbers. So that means there's a bigger infinity. And another thing that Cantor showed independently of this in a way that's kind of interesting is that there are more real numbers than there are natural numbers. So think of the real numbers as the ones between 0 and 1 start 0 point, and then you have a whole lot of numbers coming after it. That's one way of thinking. All the numbers of that form between 0 and 1 are all the real numbers between 0 and 1. And there's more of them than there are natural numbers as well. And then there's this interesting question about how the number that goes with the subsets is related to the number that goes with the real numbers. And that's a kind of, I think, still an unresolved question in set theory.
Right. So now, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, so Cantor's got, he wants to say there's the potential infinite, then there's these actual infinities, which apparently come in different sizes, even though they're all infinite. And then he wants to say there's this other separate category of infinity that he wants to apply to God.
So I think that's right. What he thinks is that if you're kind of measuring God, no number will do. So what you have to say is that kind of God's beyond, right? And that sort of takes you back to the intuitive notion of infinity again, after he's done all this work to establish all of this mathematics. But what you can't do is say that kind of the infinity of God is the infinity of the natural numbers or the real numbers, or pick some bigger one. It's so big that it goes beyond all of them. And so in that way, Cantor kind of claimed that there was this theological significance to what he'd done. But intuitively, when people started talking about God's infinity, some of them may well have just thought, well, it's sort of like the natural numbers. It's immeasurable. You can't count it, right? And so it's not clear that Cantor really added anything to that idea, at least not to me.
Right. And so that's the idea, I guess. Okay. So I guess what I'm kind of thinking about is, could I give you a really rigorous, coherent model of God without even ever having to use the word infinity? Um, and I think I can, because I want to say that in most cases, whatever notion of infinity you have, that's really not doing any work. It's doing something else is doing the work to develop the doctrine of God.
So, so
Yeah.
this might lead into the next topic about time in an
Hmm.
interesting way. I
Possibly.
don't know.
I've got some other things I want to say about time as
Yeah,
well. Yeah.
but if we should finish with infinity before we go there, but I'll
Yes.
just try to remember the thought that I'm just having
Okay.
now.
Good. Good.
So,
Good. So one of the arguments I want to run to say, like, you can't really make these tight connection between the mathematical concepts of infinity and God is to go, well, let's start with going really literal. So an actual infinite is supposed to be like this sort of simultaneous set of all the numbers. And I'm like, okay, cool. Well, that doesn't tell me anything about God, because God's not a set of numbers, as far as I can tell. Um, and numbers are abstract objects, and I don't think God's an abstract object. So I can't be very literal when I'm talking about God being infinite in that sort of sense, right?
so unless you're a kind of conceptualist, right, the numbers are ideas in the mind of God, because then there's a kind of infinity that's sitting inside the divine mind in some sort of way.
Maybe. So that's the second argument I wanted to bring up. So here's another one I want to go with, is to go, okay, so let's look at this other concept of infinity that I was mentioning earlier, where you say maybe infinity applies to individual attributes. And so let's look at like omniscience. Well, if I want to say God's omniscient, maybe I'm like, well, okay, to help me really guide my thinking here is to say God has knows an infinite number of propositions, something like that. So E.J. Lowe has this argument that for any proposition, you could get an infinite number of propositions. So take the proposition 2 plus 2 equals 4. And you're like, well, that's true. And then there's a proposition about that saying, well, it's true that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And there's a proposition about that, and a proposition about that, and so on until infinity. Well, if that's the case, well, you could have God having knowing an infinite number of propositions, but they're all about 2 plus 2 equaling 4. And I want to be like, but I hope God, if God's really omniscient, I hope he knows more than just an infinite number of propositions about 2 plus 2 equaling 4. So it seems in this case, just saying God has infinite knowledge is not really informing me about anything. It seems like I want to say more than that. I want to say whatever propositions. I don't know if it's a finite number or an infinite number. I don't know. But God's got to know that. So it's something broader than just saying merely like an infinite number of propositions.
So you might think though that the commitment to God's knowing all the propositions commits you to an actual infinity if it turns out that Lowe's right and there's an actual infinity of distinct true propositions. And if you're the kind of person who doesn't like actual infinities, then that might be slightly disconcerting.
Maybe. So if the claim is whatever the propositions are, whatever number they happen to be, I don't know, but God's going to know them all. That seems like that's guiding my thinking in terms of whatever omniscience is.
Yeah.
And this is infinity stuff, if there happens to be an actual infinite. That's just I guess, cherry on top for it, but it's not the infinity stuff that's guiding it.
Right. And so long as the topic here is just about God, then that's right. But if you've got commitments elsewhere that lead you to deny actual infinities, then you might start to worry, or maybe not, depending upon what the commitment is, but there's some extra work to do. So it's kind of one question whether sort of knowing that God's infinite is kind of informing you in an interesting way about God. But there is this other question about whether thinking that God's infinite then generates commitments elsewhere that might be interesting. So I wrote a paper about this particular topic. So this is something that I have thought about a little bit. Not that I came to any very definitive conclusions.
Okay. Yeah. Is there anything more you wanted to elaborate on this paper?
I don't think so. And I've told you what the kind of main thought is, and then you just think about all the different ways in which people have wanted to say that God's infinite, and then think about, okay, so what would you be committed to given plausible assumptions about what's out there? Right? And are we going to generate commitments to actual infinities in ways that will be disconcerting for people who else would want to deny that there are such things?
Oh, right. Because I think I remember you had an argument for, well, if I really want actual infinities, oh gosh, if I've got this Kalam cosmological argument that's relying on there can't be an infinite past, I might undermine my arguments for the existence of God. Like, was it stuff like this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the sort of worry.
hmm I think it's a good worry to raise. So I wanted to run one other argument by you. This is related to God's power. So again, the thought is infinity really helping me understand and articulate my concept of God? And so let's say again, let's look at God's power. Do we want to say that God's power is infinite? And I guess if you would be saying God's power is infinite, you'd be saying there's like an infinite set of possible actions that God could perform. Now, here's a worry. It seems that infinity, if you subtract from it, you're supposed to still have infinity left over because the mathematicians say we leave infinity undefined when we're doing
It
that.
depends how much. I mean, if you subtract enough, like think about the natural numbers and take away all but the first three, and what's left is finite. So it depends what you're
Mhm.
subtracting. But if I take away one number, what's going to be left will definitely be still infinite.
See, and I just find this weird. And here's why I want to say it's weird. So it seems to me that when God performs actions, one of the things he's doing is he's shrinking the set of subsequent actions that God could perform. So think of the set of actions of the first thing that God creates. Well, there's only so many things. Like if God decides I'm going to create this thing first, well, then he excludes all the other stuff that he could create first. And so any subsequent action he performs, he can't create any of that other stuff first because he's already picked something. And so it seems like there's a huge shrinkage in the terms of options that God has, but yet he still has infinite power. And I'm like, are we really talking about infinity here in terms of like an infinite set of possible actions? Because I've shrunk them. And then for each subsequent action that God performs, again, it's going to be shrinking the options further and further. And if you want to go, well, maybe I'm not really thinking in terms of like actual infinite sets. Maybe I just mean God's power is unlimited. And I'm like, okay, cool, fine. Let's stick with this. Is this really telling me anything? Well, then you start asking very standard questions that most standard accounts of omnipotence want to answer the word no. So can God do logical contradictions? Well, no, of course not. Can God change the past? Other than a few of my friends who are alive today, everyone else wants to go, no, of course not. Can God go against his covenantal promises? Well, no. And these are all limits. And this last one is a self-imposed limit that God puts on himself. And in which case I'm going, well, there's far too many limits for a being of unlimited power. So is unlimited really doing the thing that guides our thinking here? Because infinite sets doesn't seem like it's really guiding our thinking, in at least in any so obvious sort of way. And then unlimited, I don't know if that's really doing our thinking either. It seems like other concepts about power and action and freedom and the consequences of those things, those seem to be the things that are really guiding our thinking and developing a concept of omnipotence instead of different notions of infinity. I don't know. So what do you think about this?
Well, a few things. So I think that what's guiding the notion of omnipotence might be something quite different. So, um, but so what I'm thinking there is that maybe the right way to think about the divine omnipotence is just that. Oh, sorry. The right way to think about it, omnipotence, is that an omnipotent being can just do what God can do, right?
Okay.
Which you might think sounds kind of circular, but when you've spent a lot of time looking at the attempts in the literature to say what omnipotence is, you might start feeling that this is not a game that you want to keep on playing, right? So,
Sure.
I mean, in a way, that's kind of similar, I think. It's the sort of thought that Geach had when he wanted to say we should stop talking about omnipotence and just talk about almightiness, where almightiness was already just this concept of the power that God has. Okay, that's not helpful. So it's not entirely relevant to what you were saying. So one thing that might turn out that you do want to say is in the beginning, God was confronted with infinitely many options, and he was able to choose amongst them and pick any one of them. And so, in that sense, he had infinite power. And you might also want to say, right now, if you think about the options that, I mean, I'm making now some assumptions about temporality, maybe,
Sure.
but right now, there are infinitely many different things that God could do. I mean, we could maybe something like Lowe's trick with the propositions. We can just run some variant on that to I mean, it won't be exactly that. The point I want to make here is that infinity is weird, and you can take lots of stuff away from an infinite collection and still have an infinity left. So you could have this view where God's power is always infinite in the mathematical sense, even though you've got this steady shaving off of lots of options, maybe infinitely many. So one of the things that Cantor proved, I think, is that a countable union of countable sets is still countable, right? So what this means is that if you think about the natural numbers, that's a countable set. We can count it. And now suppose that for each number we've got one of those sets. Right? We've still only got an amount of things that we could count. Right? These are kind of one of the many weird features of infinity. So even if we imagine that God's got choice points, as many as there are numbers, and at each one he loses as many things as there are things we can count, he'll still have enough left that at every future choice point the same thing can happen. He can lose infinitely many things and still make infinitely many choices. Mm-hmm. That just comes out of the mathematics of infinity. So I'm not sure that there's a kind of in principle worry here for thinking about God's power in terms of infinity, but I'm sympathetic to your view that that's probably not the best way to think about it.
So when mathematicians start doing this sort of stuff, do you ever have the worry that they're just playing with numbers and they're not really describing anything real in the world?
So, that's complicated in a different way, right? So now we're going to start talking about the relationship between scientific models and what's being modeled. Lots of scientific models just make assumptions about continuity. So they just use the real numbers to model the world. Do they really think that space is infinitely divisible in the way that it would have to be for it to be literally true? That's not clear, because it's not clear that that's a feature of the models, that they're thinking has to be faithfully representing what's in the world. Right? There are some aspects of the models that they're going to be realist about and others not. So it's not clear.
Sure. Okay, fair enough. So, are you ready to go on to time stuff?
Yeah, sure.
Sounds good. Okay. So this is the final topic that I proposed for us to talk about, is just God's relationship to time. So on my own view, I want to reject divine timelessness and affirm divine temporality. But one of the things that's frustrated me trying to write a lot of this and do a lot of research on this is hardly anyone even wants to bother to define first what it means to be timeless and temporal. So I've tried to do that in every single paper I publish on the topic. And then hardly anyone wants to even bother defining time. And I find that really annoying, because I'm like, if we're going to talk about God's relationship to time, but you won't tell me what time is, well, then what are we talking about? So I can start by defining how I understand timelessness and temporality, and we can go from there if that sounds good.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. So to say that God is eternal, as I understand it, when I look throughout like most of church history, to say that God's eternal just means that God exists without beginning and without end. Now, if you want to say that God's timeless or temporal, then you're going to have to add some extra claims. So if you say God's timeless, you're saying without beginning, without end, eternal, but also without succession. So he's not changing, he's not doing one thing and then another. And then without temporal location, and then without temporal extension. So this timeless being doesn't stand in any sort of successive relationships, doesn't exist now. So according to Paul Helm, God can't have any sort of temporal relations, like earlier than, later than, simultaneous, because only temporal beings can have, stand in temporal relations. So if you want a timeless being, Paul Helm's going to say, you really need to make it timeless. Now, if God's going to be temporal, as I understand it, God's going to be an eternal being, so without beginning and without end. But God can have succession, so God can do one thing after another if he wants. And then God can have temporal location. So does God exist right now? The temporalist is going to go, yeah, sure. Whereas the proponent of divine timelessness is going to have to go, not really. God doesn't really exist right now, which sounds weird, but it's an entailment of the view. So I will just pause right there to see, like, what do you think of those definitions, at least?
So, so there might be other ways to go about what you think is the kind of what's essential to time. So you might think that if you don't have metric, so you don't have a measure of how far it is between 2 points, then you don't have time. That's really the essential thing. And you can still have location and succession without having time. And one of the ways in which this theoretical possibility, or whatever you want to call it, might matter is because there are kind of physical models where physicists want to say things like this, that there are parts of the manifold where you don't have time because there's no metric defined there. And so you can still see things like it's earlier, but you can't say how much earlier it is. So that's one thought. I mean, I don't know what you want to say about that.
I want to say, when at least just looking at what all the major proponents and all the minor proponents of divine timelessness, what they have always said is, if the being has succession, that's like one of the key characteristics of it being temporal. So I know, like Alan Paget, like a contemporary thinker, he's got this view where God's like has this relative timelessness, which just means like you can't measure God's life. I want to go, Alan, I love you, but that's just temporality. Let's stop using the phrase relative timelessness.
Okay, so then the question I want to ask is, how, if we don't have location and succession, we're going to continue to insist on eternality, right? Because it feels like you just have a beginning now if there's no succession.
Oh, like if
because
if you have like if he's timeless,
because right, if you have this timelessness view, right? If there's no succession, then if you were trying to kind of measure the extent here, it would just be zero, right? So
or one, you'd say it's just one moment. It's a timeless
moment.
Yeah.
Well, so okay, so you can count it you can count it as one moment.
Yeah.
But you get people in the tradition like Boethius who say things which to me just sound incoherent at this point.
Yeah, so let me defend Boethius as best as I can, because I want to reject timelessness outright. But so Boethius and others, they make several claims about God having like this simultaneous possession of life all at once, and that just sounds false from the start, because you want to talk about like sometimes they'll use phrases like eternal duration.
Yeah, well, that's the one I wanted to pick.
That's what I thought you wanted. Yeah, so let me defend this. I think I can defend this on their behalf. So they'll often point out, different medieval thinkers will point out there's different notions of duration. So they'll talk about two different kind of durations, and then the third kind is timeless duration, and that's the one you're interested in. So the first kind of duration is just a succession of moments, and they'll say, well, your life has duration. I can conceptually divide your life up into temporal parts, not real temporal parts, like like what Ted Sider wants or something, but like conceptual. In my mind, I can conceptually divide them up. And then the next kind of duration is what we today would call endurantism. So you are wholly located at the present moment. And they're often assuming presentism, at least historically in the West. And so they're going to say, yeah, like really, like you're right here, right now. You don't actually have all these temporal parts. I can conceptually divide up, though, your life into these different parts. And so Anselm makes it more explicit, where he says, well, duration, existing as a whole or all at once, that's the perfection at play here. That's the great making property, is existing as a whole or all at once. And you're like, okay, well, yeah, I exist as a whole or all at once. You do too. Okay, yeah, so God must have that. but wouldn't it be really bad if we could conceptually divide God's life up into different temporal parts? Because then he'd have some kind of succession in his life. And what Anselm does, and it seems like he's trying to follow Boethius and others, is to go, right. Well, conceptual distinctions are altogether foreign to a simple God. So none of those can apply. So what you have is God existing at a present, just like us. And so he exists as a whole all at once, just like we do at the present. But this is just a single present moment that never comes, and there's no coming and going. There's no succession. And you cannot make these conceptual distinctions like you can with our lives in God. So when they talk about eternal duration, they're wanting to say God's an endurant being in terms of existing as a whole. And that's the perfection that he has at this single timeless moment. So there's a lot of objections you could raise there, but that one I want to at least go, I think I can defend the coherence of what they mean by eternal duration.
So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. So now we've got duration that's completely non-mathematical in its conception. I mean, if you're thinking about duration as we need a metric, right? And not just the kind of trivial we can count it as one, right? Then there is not going to be duration there. So,
right.
I mean, I agree that you've made sense of it, but you're not using the word duration in the way that I was.
No, exactly. And that's what I think is going on historically is because at first like when I first started researching this many years ago, I thought that objections like yours, and I mean everybody was bringing up these objections, and I thought, well, that's just that's right. And then was looking at some of the claims, and I was like, oh, they're making claims about endurantism as being the perfection. And then found these statements from various medieval thinkers going, there's 3 different meanings by duration, and then they'd try to lay them out, and I was like, oh, we're looking at a different concept than what they have in mind when they're talking about eternal duration. But that's the best I can do to defend divine timelessness, because everything from there I want to go, this doesn't work. God's knowledge is going to change as the world changes. If God's really omnipresent, you can't exist without succession and be omnipresent to a world filled with succession. I just think these things are going to be incoherent. I think there's going to be problems there.
Right. Though, I mean, of course, people in the tradition don't think so.
Right.
And I'm sure that another thing that Boethius thought was that God's impassible. Right.
Yes.
And so there isn't anything going back from our world to God.
Correct.
There's no influence going in that direction. And then the other thing is that if you think that God really just picks a possible world and says, let it be, right, then, and picks it. So then there only has to be the one divine act. But even if you don't think that, you might think that God knows what's going to be required at every time. And it's sort of like you fire out 1,000,000 arrows, one for each of the points where it's going to be required to land. And so you still only need one divine act. So it's not immediately obvious to me that the kind of timelessness thing is incoherent.
Right. Yeah. No, I think I would have to give out a lot more arguments than I can do in the remaining time we have. Yeah. So I don't think it's just like, come on, you got nothing. I'm like, well, no. Okay, let's look at various claims about creation ex nihilo and omniscience and try to fill in the details. But I want to, with the remaining time we have, I want to look at divine temporality and see if we can make sense of this. And then also the question, what is time? So when it comes to like what is time, like there's standardly these two accounts of like there's the relational theory, which time is just this relationship between events and change. And I've got a lot of worries about that view. And then there's this absolute theory that I find really intriguing. And then something I wanted to run by you is some of the stuff I've been looking at more recently and trying to develop is there's this tradition in the Christian world with Isaac Newton and Samuel Clarke and a bunch of others. And then within Hinduism with Raghunath Shiramani and some others, where they want to say time is an attribute of God. So they want to go with this claim that the absolute theory is true and God is time or identified with time in some kind of way. So let me articulate this and then see what you think. So yeah, or did you have a question first?
So is this sort of like the divine sensorium? Is that
It's something in the neighborhood of that. Yeah. I don't know what to do with space. I just find space very mysterious, so I can only tell you about time stuff. Yeah,
But you might want to link the two together.
a lot of people do. Yeah, all the people I mentioned, they do that. I still just want to go. I just don't know what space is. Maybe give me a few years and I'll tell you. But right now, I'm like, I don't know. I got nothing. So here's a view of what you might say time is on this sort of account. So this comes from Marcello Fiocco. And so Fiocco says time is a natured entity that makes change possible. It's the source of moments, and it's the thing that unifies a series of moments. And then what he takes a moment of time to be is a moment of time is like a win. So it's like a moment of time, like it's the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. And so I want to say, well, okay, well, it's cool. We can make that God. So God is a natured entity that makes change possible. It could be the source of moments and could be the thing that organizes a series of moments into a coherent timeline. It's just whatever doctrine of providence you have. So God's a natured entity that makes change possible because God's a being that's got power and free will. God is the source of moments. So there's the first moment, God prior to creation. There's a way things are. God hanging out by himself with power and freedom. And things could be subsequently otherwise because God could freely exercise his power to make things otherwise. And then whatever kind of timeline follows from that just depends on whatever theory of providence you want to throw in. So in this way, God satisfies all the three roles of what time is. And so you can identify time with God in this sort of way. And so I'm hoping this might make sense of what people like Newton and Raghunatha Shiramani and others were trying to get at. But, see what you think of that.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about that. That's an idea I've never come across before. It sounds like it will be as an account of time. It's maybe not going to fit very well with scientific conceptions of time, but that's fine. I mean, we've already talked about other notions that apply one way in some contexts
Right.
and differently in the theological context. So, yeah, I think that's interesting.
So with regards to the scientific claims, what I guess what I want to say is most of the stuff that we do when we're looking at science is what we're really concerned with is not time itself, but with features of a particular timeline. So does it have a metric? How do we develop an accurate clock? Does it have an arrow? Like those sorts of things. And I'm like, well, those are all features of a particular timeline. So it's not features of time itself. And so all the scientific claims would attach to whichever ordering of moments comes about.
Right. So,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking that people who study general relativity or the successes that are quantum gravity and things
Mhm.
like that will probably have a different view about what they're doing and think that really they are trying to tell you what time is.
Maybe. So I see this is just anecdotal evidence, but I think it's still a fun story. So I'm going to be doing a workshop with the Higgs Center for Theoretical Physics at the University of Edinburgh. And originally, what I had proposed to them was the question, "What is time?" And I was like, "We'll get some physicists, we'll get some philosophers together, and we'll talk about what is time." And they immediately wrote back, going, "We don't know what time is. That's a philosophical question. So can we do something else?" And I was like, "Sure." And so we negotiated to the problems of time that the different
Yeah.
subdisciplines within physics deal with, and then the different subdisciplines within philosophy deal with. But I just love that reaction. Was like, "We don't know. That's your job. As a philosopher, that's your job." And I was like, okay, good to know. Good to know.
Right. So yeah, they may be quite Augustinian.
They might be, yeah. So Augustine's someone I wanna attack in the book manuscript I'm looking at right now, where I'm going, okay, so you wanna say, I know what time is, unless you ask me, and then have all this confidence about answering all these questions about God and time, and I'm like, how can you have so much confidence if you don't know the answer to that question? So yeah, so they might be Augustinian, but they were just genuinely uncomfortable with that question. Like, we can't do that. That's too big. That's too big for us. Whereas I know other physicists I've talked to, they're like, oh yeah, I'll tell you exactly what time is. Yeah. So we've got a few minutes. Are there any, I guess, objections you would have to just divine temporality in general that you might want to run before we end?
Um,
Since we haven't given them any
so,
hell yet.
so I guess one question, which was sort of lying behind the question about space, is if you think that space and time are this kind of indivisible unity, then your count has to say what space is as well as what time is, and presumably has to say that God is space as well as time. But then that will just take you to the kind of Newtonian, something more like what I imagine the Newtonian view was.
Right. And that is in fact what Newton and a bunch of these others do, is they just go absolute space. That's also an attribute or mode of God. And then whatever the physical objects are in their relationships, I don't know. That's an empirical question. That's for the scientists to figure out. Whereas I just want to go, philosophy of space and then physics of space. I don't know. I got nothing.
Right, but there is this kind of, I mean, I guess there's this kind of worry that in the end you'd like to have an account of space that you can put together nicely with your account of time, and so maybe in the end you'll end up tending more towards Newton.
Yeah, we'll see in a couple of years what happens. Yeah. So James is back. Yeah.
Yep, that's like a perfect way to pin it. Like Ryan and Oppy, you guys did great hitting all these different points, giving us a little bit on each particular subject. Now, if you guys want to plug what you got going on, we can start with Ryan and then go to Oppy. Ryan, what's going on with you?
Cool. So I'm working on 2 book projects at the moment. One is called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker, where I'm trying to identify a bunch of different models of God and then ask the question, if you want to say God's temporal, what are your options? And then what sort of problems are you going to encounter along the way? And then how are you going to deal with them? Because there's a lot of problems that pop up that you need to think through. And then the other project is called A Little Book About a Big God, where I'm trying to just lay out just my own thinking about what I think God is like, and look at some different issues related to the nature of empathy and emotions, and what would it mean to empathize with God, and some problems related to why would God create anything at all.
And you also still have a podcast that you do?
So I'm still doing the Reluctant Theologian podcast. I've got enough episodes at the moment to get me all the way through Christmas, a bunch of crazy stuff on God and Time with Eric Wielenberg and Christy Miller and William Lane Craig. And then I've got a bunch of episodes with Sam Liebens on philosophy of Judaism and idealism and and some crazy hypertime stuff. So that's some of the things that are coming up with the podcast at the moment.
Fantastic. Oppy, what do you have going on? If you want to mention some of the books that you've written, some are very fantastic reads.
So I do have a new book co-authored with Kenny Pierce that's just come out, a debate book. I've forgotten the title. I think it is Does God Exist? It's something.
I think that's right.
Temporarily, I've forgotten the title. Anyway, that was lots of fun. So I spent a lot of the last couple of years working on that. I have a kind of new crazy project which has got nothing to do with philosophy of religion. It's in the philosophy of argumentation. I'm trying to defend the view that really the kind of what argument is for is to draw out unnoticed consequences of theories, and it's completely useless most of the time in exchanges between people. Of course, it's useful if there are things they haven't noticed about their view. And in particular, if they haven't noticed that their view leads to absurdity or contradiction, then it's a big gift to them to point it out. But that's it. That's what argumentation is good for. And this runs counter to what almost everybody says. And so I said it's kind of crazy, but I'm hoping to write a book about it eventually.
Nope. Fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and run the outro. I'll talk to you guys real fast after. Once again, I appreciate both of you guys agreeing to do this. For those who don't know, it's now 8 o'clock where I live. It's now 11 o'clock in the morning where Oppy lives. And I think it's 3 o'clock in the morning where Mullins lives. So these guys were definitely very accommodating to get this, to make it happen. And thank you guys.
I go hard in the paint, yeah, homie, I'm a saint. Ride or die.